Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Our guest today is a book writing coach, a resilience speaker, and a domestic violence advocate. And on today's live stream, she'll be sharing with you ideas on the magic of storytelling. Would you please help me welcome to the live stream, Jas Rawlinson.
Hello, hello.
Hey, Jas. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. You're a domestic violence advocate. What is this role about and what do you do?
So as a resilience speaker, I cover a lot of different areas in my work, but one that I'm really passionate about is domestic violence advocacy. And I mean, that comes from my own background of growing up with family violence, and also being the co-founder of Brisbane's first domestic violence memorial. So DV awareness is a topic that I speak a lot about in my work.
From my experience over the years, at least 1 in 6 women that I've worked with have been physically, mentally, emotionally or sexually abused. And from reading the latest reports during COVID-19, domestic violence is on the rise. What's been happening during the lockdown?
Well, I think, as most of us can imagine, it's a very difficult time for people who are currently victims of domestic violence. My heart has really been going out to those in Melbourne because they've been in lockdown for such a prolonged period of time. And when you are literally confined to your house, then it's very hard for people to get the courage to seek help. So as part of my role as a domestic violence advocate, I have been trying to help, survivors and victims this year to understand that services are still out there waiting to take their calls, and that although it's incredibly difficult and more difficult than ever, it's so important to reach out to some of those professional services because the help is there waiting. But of course, we know that there are so many roadblocks and it's been harder for people to get access because there's been such a huge spike in domestic violence cases this year as well. So it's been a very, very difficult time for many people.
We've seen the damage and the aftermath of it. One of my clients, Simone O'Brien, she was one of the worst victims of domestic violence in Australia, where the perpetrator had hit her over the head more than 50 times with a baseball bat. And it caved in her skull. She lost the sight in her eye. And I think for almost close to a decade, she's still having operations for corrective procedures. We also
It's interesting. I just connected with Simone actually about a month ago, and she was sharing some of her story, and it's incredible what she has come through, but horrific that she ever had to experience that.
We also have another advocate, one of our clients, Rebecca Jarrett Dalton, and she's from a mortgage broking business in Sydney called Two Red Shoes. And she sits on the board of The Haven, and they provide emergency shelter for women of domestic violence. And there is a need for it in today's community, but I believe it starts with a lot of awareness and seeing these red flags, which Simone talks about. Before we move on from domestic violence and talk about the magic of storytelling, what are some of the red flags that both men and women should look out for with domestic violence?
Yeah, I really love speaking about, understanding the red flags because for me, I mean, some of the abuse that I've experienced in my personal life, it wasn't physical. So, I've been through sexual assault and I've also been through emotional and, mental abuse. But so many men and women don't understand that domestic violence is not always just physical. So some of the red flags, that come from the non-physical side of things, we can have financial abuse where a partner will withhold funds or they'll make that person, beg or apply for a certain amount of wages or money each week. We also see things like spiritual abuse, which is very big in faith communities. As an example, I've had many writing clients who have been victims in the past of spiritual abuse. So where a partner will say things to them like, well, as a good Christian woman, you should submit to your husband. You should forgive him, 70 times 7, all kinds of things like that, saying, well, just need to pray harder and lean more into God, and rely on him to get you through the problems you're having.
It's fascinating to see it from that angle, Jas. Spiritual abuse. Please continue.
Yeah,
It's interesting.
yeah, so many people don't speak about this side of abuse. We hear about, we hear more often these days about mental and emotional abuse, but spiritual abuse is a really, really big one that a lot of people often miss, and often they don't understand until sometimes decades later what it is they've been through. And another one, just quickly, is understanding the role of gaslighting. That's something that I went through in a relationship where I experienced a sexual assault. And after that particular experience, this person was saying things to me to really mess with my my mind and my memories of what had happened. And he would say things like, "Oh, is that really what happened? Is that what you remember happening? Oh, no, that it didn't happen that way. That's not what happened." And so gaslighting is a form of psychological manipulation where the person really does make you believe that either you're going crazy or that your version of facts and reality are not actually what happened. So that's a very big one that's often used as well.
One of the ones that I've seen is in the Islamic community was parents using this spiritual, what was the word? Spiritual, what was it? Spiritual abuse. Spiritual abuse over their children. And what they would do is they'd say, after dark, the jinn comes out. And so what they'd do is they'd instill this fear of the jinn into their children. And even as adults, I was working with a gentleman, he was about 28 years of age, and he was not scared of the dark, but scared because when it was dark, the jinn came. And the parents had full control. And it was very interesting to see it in that culture and in that respect as well. Fascinating. So gaslighting. Gaslighting, is that the word? Can you just run back over that? Because this is something that I haven't heard before, but it is fascinating, and we'll use that as the segue to learn more about the magic of storytelling.
Well, it is really interesting because, like I said before, so many people they haven't really heard of it, or they don't understand it. So frequently when I do speaking engagements and I'm sharing my story and I'm sharing stories from my book series, Reasons to Live, I talk a lot about gaslighting. And it's always one of the first questions that comes up during Q&A, where people will say, "Oh, what is gaslighting? Can you share what that is?" And as I start to talk about, how it's a psychological form of manipulation, and it's where the person makes you doubt your own memory of what happened in order to keep you under their control, or for you not to be able to kind of get an understanding of what has been happening. And it's a very insidious and harmful form of abuse, but so many people miss it because they're looking for the physical signs. They're waiting, their partner hasn't pushed them, they haven't slapped them, so therefore they think, well, it's not really that bad. I can't, is it really worth leaving over this? But it's incredibly harmful, and sometimes even, I would argue, more harmful than physical abuse, because while physical abuse can mend and the bruises go away, it takes so much longer. And in my clients' cases, some of them are still dealing with those psychological scars that have occurred, up to 20 years prior.
It's fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing. One of your special super skills here is a book writing coach. We've learned about your resiliency speaking and being an advocate of domestic violence. What is the importance of being able to tell a good story? I remember my grandfather was a phenomenal storyteller, and I'd look up to him with eyes this big and think, gee, one day I'd love to learn to tell a story. But he seemed to have some magical power. He seemed to have a strategy, and I didn't know what that was. So what is the magic of storytelling, and what's some ideas you can share with us on how to become better storytellers?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, we just have to remember that, the story is really, anytime we want to get any kind of information across, whether it's for our business or whether it's just, imparting knowledge to somebody that we care about, the story is really the heart of it. When you think about sharing a story with someone. Like imagine if you're, and I'm sure everyone's been in this situation, imagine you've gone to a conference and there's something you really want to learn about, and somebody gets up with their PowerPoint presentation and they just ran you through a whole lot of bullet points about how to, imagine it's like how to make the perfect goat curry or something like that. If somebody just
PowerPoint.
Yeah, death by PowerPoint, or something. Probably should pick something more boring than how to make a good curry. But somebody wants to teach you how to create your own website. If they get up there and it's just a PowerPoint list with bullet points, it's so boring when you're just listening to statistics or step-by-step information. But if you can insert stories into how you talk about your business or how you talk about anything that you want to share with people, it's so much easier when you're really engaged and listening to a story. So for example, like when I share my story, if I just got up and said, so I lived in a home with family violence, and I went through a lot of anxiety, and then I got to the stage now where I'm a public speaker and I just sort of talk like that. It's very different to when I get up and I start in the middle of a story from my journey. So a story I like to share is, it was a summer day. I was driving down a 4-lane freeway, my hands gripped tightly on the wheel, as the voices swirled around and around my head telling me, you should have stopped. What happened? It's your fault. Why didn't you say no? And I share this story about having a panic attack at 110 kilometers an hour on a freeway. And you think about, I could just get up and say, I've suffered from panic attacks. I once had a panic attack when I was driving down the highway. It's completely different to bringing the person into that moment and bringing them on the journey with you. So I guess if I can share anything, it's that, the magic of storytelling or a good story is all about taking someone on the journey with you and making them feel that they're actually in that moment as well.
Just something came to my mind as you were talking about that. I remember watching the movie Zoolander. Derek Zoolander says to Hansel, "Cool story, Hansel."
Cool story, Hansel.
It's amazing, these stories, and I think we forget that all movies are stories, and Hollywood is based in storytelling, and it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. I was watching the shorts here for Maverick, which is the next Top Gun movie, and I'm 8 minutes into the preview and I'm totally hooked and time stands still. And they have this wonderful ability to put you inside of that story. And for a moment, I thought I was the one flying the jet. And so storytelling, I believe it really engages us and it puts us in different positions. And from emotional intelligence, we have to be able to look into other people's worlds and understand what it feels like to be them. And
Absolutely.
Like you're saying here, as you're driving down the freeway, gripping the steering wheel, it's happening inside of my mind and I can feel my hands tightening up and I can feel the panic attack kicking in. So it's a very good way to associate. In terms of telling stories, Jas, what screws up a good story?
That's a good question too. Yeah.
What screws it up?
I think one of the biggest things is when, and this is particularly for business owners or someone that's running some sort of company or organization, when they get too much into just trying to convey like statistics and theory, and they have all this knowledge in their head and they want to get it across, but it becomes that death by PowerPoint because there's no point of connection. It's so true that storytelling is the best way to get people to know and like and trust us. And if you're just spouting off statistics and just trying to share information without thinking about how you're actually going to connect to your audience or your ideal reader or whoever it is, then that's really what screws up a story. I mean, a story without storytelling without any story to it, that's really basically what stops a story from having the power that it can have.
For you in telling your story, I want to go back to your story about domestic violence. Knowing what you now know, what would have you done earlier on with your story? What would have you done differently about your story?
Do you mean like living my life, or in terms of like writing my book,
In
or?
terms of telling your story, what would have you done differently? Because what I find is a lot of people have a story to tell, and they hold on to it, and they want to share it, and they tell everybody got a great story. Well, what are you going to do? You're going to tell it or not? And a lot of people, it's like Les Brown says. He says the richest place in the world is the graveyard, and most people take their stories to the grave. So, knowing what you now know about storytelling, what would have you done differently with your story?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not actually sure if there's anything I would have done differently, but I can certainly share from clients of mine. So, as an example, I talk to so many people, all the time who have a dream of writing their story. Um, in fact, it's something like 800, something like 800 million Americans have a dream of writing their story. Or sorry, I think it's over 2 million, 200 million, sorry, getting my facts jumbled today. 200 million Americans have a dream of sharing their story and writing a book during their lifetime. But only around 10% actually go on to achieve that dream of writing their book. So the problem is that so many people hold onto their story for lots of different reasons. They either go, I'll share my story when life calms down, when I'm, more successful, when I've got more of a following, when I've got more Insta followers, and more fame, that's when I'll share it. Or people sit back in self-doubt and they think, my story isn't really worth sharing with the world. Would anybody care? Would anybody want to hear it? And so people sit back and they don't share their stories because they're waiting for this perfect moment. And then time passes and, we grow and change. And as an perfect example, one of my clients who I just finished up working with yesterday, she was saying to me, Jas, I'm so glad that I worked with you over this last 3 months, because otherwise I'm 99% sure I would still be sitting on ideas. And also when it gets into the new year, like I've already been through so many changes this year and my life's going to look even more different next year. And then I'll have to scrap everything I've written because I'll be in a new phase of life. And so that's what happens to a lot of people. They put it off, and then either they just don't get back to it, or their life changes so much that then they don't know where to start all over again. It's the same thing of, I was already overwhelmed to start with, but I wrote, say, 5 chapters. Now my life's changed again and I have completely different ideas for my book, but now I have to start all over again and I don't know where to start. So yeah, I would just say people just bog themselves down by just thinking that there is a perfect time to write, when in actual fact, there is no perfect time. If you have a story that you want to share, then you should start now before you feel ready, because I can say honestly that any success that I've ever achieved has not come because I felt ready. There's been plenty of speaking gigs I've had where I've felt I've had imposter syndrome. I felt that I shouldn't have been there. I wasn't good enough to do it. But if I'd held myself back, I would never have had those opportunities. So you got to start before you're ready.
Well, it sounds like a lot of people develop what I call excusitis, and it's an inflammation of the excuse-making gland, but it's based in fears. Most people, from what I can see, is they won't tell their story because they have fears of rejection. They have fear of criticism. Well, what if I put my story out there, which is really personal to me, and then people turn up their nose? Fear of criticism. What if they start to write bad reviews about it? There's also
they get on the what if train before any of it has actually happened.
All the fears come up. The fear of the unknown. Well, what's going to happen with my life? What happens if I do write a bestseller and it goes ballistic? How am I going to handle my life? Are my ex-boyfriends or ex-girlfriends going to come back and say that's a load of shit?
Yes.
And so all these fears come up, these fears of the unknown. They also have fear of failure. Well, what if I go to all this effort and it's a flop? And so the excuses come up. What if I do it and it's so incredible that I become successful? Now I've got to leave an area where I'm comfortable with. My partner, what if I become successful and my partner leaves me? There's so many fears in there as well. And I think if people can move past those fears, they can also start to tell a much better story. But if they don't, there's probably a mental or emotional block holding them back.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, Jas, with your journey in life and in business, what frustrates you the most?
Oh, that's a good one. I love having a good rant about things that frustrate me. Um, but I would say probably some of the things that we see in entrepreneurial culture. There's one thing that, I love to, talk about, how frustrating it is seeing, you go on Instagram, you go on Facebook, and you see those posts. It's that person that says, um, in my first 6 months of business, I made 7 figures, or my first 6 months of business, I cracked the 6 figures, and good for you if you did. But the thing that really annoys me is this side of entrepreneurial culture where they make you feel that if you don't achieve XYZ of success in this very small time frame, then you're either not hustling hard enough, you're not working hard enough, or you're doing something wrong. When in actual fact, when we look at some of the most successful people out there, they're people whose growth has been either slow and steady, or they've had a lot of failures and they've had to work their way up to success. Like you look at someone like J.K. Rowling, took her 7 years to write her, her first Harry Potter book, and it was rejected by something like 12 publishing houses. But now it's, arguably, one of the most successful books of all time. There's also an Australian charity here, I think, called Thank You. They do bottled water that helps to fight poverty overseas. And I think they fail. I think it was something like 3 to 5 years before they had their breakthrough and achieved success. I think it may have been 5 years. But, we look at people who are, have achieved peak success, and pretty much all the time it's somebody who has worked, they have worked incredibly hard. They've gotten support for themselves, but they've failed a lot of times, throughout their journey, but they haven't given up, and it's taken a long time, and that's okay. So yeah, it really annoys me when I see this whole, if you just hustle harder, or, you should be able to make this much in your first couple of months of business, when really I think that we just need to remember that good things take time, and it's completely normal for your business success to take time to come.
Words of wisdom. And as you've grown your business and as you've moved on from domestic violence personally, what mental or emotional blocks had held you back in the past?
Oh, yeah, there's definitely big ones that I've struggled with, and some that I do still struggle with a bit today. I think one of the biggest one is just, the fear of failure. That's one that I deal with from my childhood, with, dealing with a very mentally abusive father. And yeah, just that fear of failing, and that self-doubt. And when you get knocked back, you've tried really hard at something, you feel like you're just, chipping away all the time, but you're not really getting anywhere. And that's when it's really hard. It can be really hard to find the resilience to go on. So that's something I've had to work at over time. And for me, the most helpful thing has been working with a coach or having a mentor to help me through those mindset issues. I think it's important for people to know that you don't have to be able to solve everything alone. We don't know what we don't know, and it's completely okay to reach out for help and get support to work through those mental or emotional blocks that are holding you back, because you can go so much further when you actually have support.
And for the other guests who are watching and they're going through that fear of failure, and perhaps they grew up in an abusive family, what advice would you give them on overcoming the fear of failure?
Well, I'd just say, I encourage you to take a leaf out of my book and understand that it's okay to reach out for support. And if that's starting with, finding a really supportive and good therapist that can help you to work through, those self-doubts and, all of those emotions that are coming up, then I would definitely encourage you to do that. But I would also say that it is so helpful, like if you're in business and you have a business idea, it is really helpful to get support from a coach. And that's been the thing that's helped me a lot. And, I only really properly started my business 2 years ago. I had no idea what I was doing. And, it's still like 2 years on, I'm still quite, kind of in the baby steps of my business, but I would not have achieved what I have achieved. I would not have been able to speak at, international conferences, or, be able to have incredible opportunities to work with clients around the world. If I had not invested with Coach 2 years ago, I would still be in that same fear of failure mindset where I just thought, I should just give up because it's too hard. So I'd encourage you to get that support for yourself, whatever that looks like, so that you can actually continue growing.
Wonderful advice. Well, ladies and gentlemen, today you've met Jas Rawlinson, and she shared with you ideas on the magic of storytelling. And what I'd encourage you to do right now is to begin telling your story. Don't wait. This is the perfect time right now. Jas, thank you so much for being here with us today. For the people who'd like to learn more about Jas, go to her website, jasrawlinson.com. Jas, thank you so much for sharing your advice, and we wish you a wonderful day.
You're welcome. Thank you so much, Daniel.
Thank you so much. Ciao for now.
Yeah.